My name's Georgia Mason. I'm director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. It's 12:30 here in Guelph, and it's a snowy day for lands that are in the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. But our two speakers today are the other side of the Atlantic, and for them it's early evening. I'm really grateful for them to spend what's really chipping into free time to talk to us today. And they're continuing our mini-series on animal law by conveying what good looks like. What does good animal protection and effective animal law look like around the world? So our two speakers are Yvonne Niño, who is the policy officer for the World Veterinary Association. She's a practicing lawyer who's currently doing her second master's. She's already got a master's in international law. She's currently doing her second master's on animal law and society. And our other speaker is Dr. Frida Lundmark Hedman, and she's a researcher based at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala. And she's got a special research interest in regulations and policies around protecting animals. But before she was an academic, she was actually an animal welfare inspector. So she's really seen kind of both sides of things. So how this is going to work is Yvonne is going to present and her title, sorry, let me rootle around and dig out her precise title, is Animal Protection Law from Law to Action, Principles, Cases and Challenges. And then Frida's going to present, and she's going to focus on Sweden, which we all know is the best at everything. And she's going to talk about Swedish animal welfare legislation, purpose, enforcement, and again, some challenges. And then we'll have joint questions at the end. If you've got questions, which I'm sure you will, put them in the chat and then we'll read them out at the end. We would love to have you engage yourself, but we've had some hideous Zoom bombing experiences, so we're going to just use the chat. Okay, so without further ado, I'd love to welcome Yvonne to the floor to give her presentation. Thanks so much, Yvonne.
Thank you. Oh. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Georgia, for inviting us. Thank you, Laura, for helping, and Frida for sharing this space. Thank you for organizing this series of seminars. We have a quite ambitious agenda, and we'd like to explore fundamental principles behind effective animal protection laws. I'm presuming that you already understand the difference between animal rights, animal law, and animal welfare law. Okay, and that's why I decided to call it animal protection laws. And we'll try to see where do we come from, what is the current situation, a bit of focusing in Europe, just to be able to delve a bit into it, and what are the perspectives to continue the path and way forward. So to start, I'd say that animal welfare laws have a long tradition, quite long, in some countries, and they continue to develop, and they try to regulate how we look after animals. But on another note, there are some countries that only have cruelty laws or anything at all. So where do we come from? It's in the 19th century, we had our first anti-cruelty laws. They were under criminal law with negative obligations, and the ratio legis, the reason behind the law, was mostly the human interest. Just putting some examples here, and also to start seeing what is the difference. And one of the most famous one is the Loi Gramenon, and it talks about publicly and abusively mistreatment. So it also is taking, you can see that it's taking care mostly of humans more than the animal itself. And we have the Cruelty Treatment of Cattle Act, which is the first anti-cruelty law in the UK, and some other acts, but that talks about prohibiting the painful experiments on living animals. So in the 1950s, we start with the first animal welfare laws with species protections that have where we start to have positive obligations. So not only what not to do to animals, but also what do we need to do to assess their welfare. we have our first species protection, and also in this case, the ratio legis starts to be the public interest in the animal welfare. And this movement gained momentum with Ruth Harrison's book, which is pretty famous, and it led to the appointment of Professor Rogers to examine conditions of livestock farming. His report recommended a new legislation for welfare animals, and it resulted or inspired what your very well-known 5 freedoms. Pretty recently, while we have a bit of a shift, while early laws were more anthropocentric, recent shifts in many countries have begun to recognize animals as beings and also their intrinsic value. They also, in some places, they are not only or merely property, and that way they also deserve a recognition of their dignity. Some examples, I took 4 of them, but the Police Protection Act, which was pretty early, established that animals are not things. The Netherlands recognized the intrinsic value. The French Civil Code states that animals are sentient living beings. And very recent here in Spain, we also have the law of what is called protection of rights and welfare of animals. And indeed, the preamble and the reasoning behind this law, it is not that much about welfare assessment, but it's to recognize to regulate the recognition of and protection of the dignity of animals. And it regulates more how we need to treat and how we need to behave towards animals. So where are we now? I'd say that we find ourselves in a crossroads between animal welfare laws and the recognition of animals' rights, or just going further with welfare protection. In some countries, there is a shift, as it's been mentioned, between these anti-cruelty laws to welfare laws, or more comprehensive welfare laws. For example, in the European Union, just putting here a brief overview on countries that have recognized animal sentience in legislation. And for example, in Europe, what we have now is that the legislation has a kind of a tension between animals as sentient beings, but also treating goods. So animal welfare laws really aim to improve the physical and emotional well-being of animals, and these laws extend beyond preventing cruelty. They really seek to promote health and well-being through both criminal and administrative measures. However, they face limitations, and I've just named some of them here. Some of them is that some species are not protected, and a good example is always fishes. And there are many exemptions, like cultural religious practices or inadequate regulation. Animal welfare laws balance the interests of the animal, legal compliance, societal, cultural, and industrial factors, and sometimes, and most of the cases, the animals are not protected as individuals, but also as part, but mostly as part of the ecosystem. So the European Union recognizes animals as sentient beings in its legislation, and they have a big focus on farm animals. They also cover animals used for scientific purposes, but wild animals and companion animals, their protection is very limited at European Union level. I'm talking. So it also covers in some different pieces of legislation areas like leg-hold traps. Some legal texts also restrict the trade of certain products like seal products or cat and dogs fur. Then we have some articles that are also in other legal texts, like the Common Agriculture Policy, while it does not cover or is not a welfare law, it regulates things that in the end means welfare protection, course compliance and single payment, subsidies for rural development, and marketing eggs. I'm just very briefly mentioning the principle of subsidiarity, And it is worth mentioning it because of this principle, while European Union sets the laws, then it is responsibility of each state to transpose this directive into national legislation and also its enforcement. That applies to European directive. So in the end, we have a huge landscape of different pieces of legislation, which is a complex landscape. Always need to bring that is that the Article 13 of the European Union Treaty acknowledges animal sentience, but does not provide. So even if it recognizes animal sentience, it does not provide a basis for the European Union to act on animal welfare. What it does, it mandates that animal welfare must be considered in European Union policies. It's also probably worth to mention that it includes lots of exceptions. Constitutional protection is also worth mentioning it. There is a growing trend of constitutional protection for animals, which try to reflect or is also reflecting their moral and legal status. And then some countries, and I'm just selected one here, like Germany, they go beyond the European Union standards, and they have integrated animal protection into their constitution in response both to ethical and scientific advancements. So let's see an overview of some of the principal welfare laws at European level, mostly to take some destacable things that are good animal welfare and some other parts that we need to improve or take as an example or not to do. I just put here a chart of livestock population in Europe, because while most of the laws that we have are covering farm animals, it is also it is covering also a wide and enormous range of animals. So some examples, like the Council Directive on the protection of animals kept for farming purposes. This is an important rule because it gave three general rules for the protection of all vertebrate species that are raised for wool, skin, fur, whatever farming purposes. It includes lots of provisions on accommodation, feed, water, but on another note, it excludes certain species like fish, reptiles, amphibians, cephalopods that I've included here. The directive on protection of laying hens, I brought this one because it's the first time that it was introduced a clear distinction between three types of rearing. Today, and this is also good to know, it is under revision due to an European Citizens Initiative, which is the End the Cage, which it's urging the European Union to ban cages for farmed animals. Also, it is interesting that the annex includes operational requirements, including inspection. This exemplifies detailed provisions, or how detailed provisions are essential for effective welfare standards. It also mandates, and I put here the example, it also mandates the marketing or labeling of the eggs, which it can be then traced back to the farm. And this is the only European Union-wide labeling system that is compulsory and is indeed regulated by the European Union. The one of the protection of chickens for meat production is the first that have welfare indicators. That welfare indicators were included in an animal welfare legislation, which is something else to bring with us for good welfare legislations. It also includes, or in the negative side, it includes general prohibition for all mutilations, but then its exception is a vague timing, while the reality is that it's the most common type of mutilation. The one on protection of pigs is a good example, as it's a very comprehensive law, but it also includes a list of exemptions, which are most common practice. Here I included also a map where you can see where the legislation on tail docking ban The red ones are those that have gone, they have vanished completely. In orange, those that have gone, or their national law is thicker than the European standard, and the clear one is the one that is just with the European standards. The protection of animals during transport, this is a regulation. So in this case, this is directly applicable. And this is a comprehensive piece of legislation which applies to all vertebrate animals. And such mode is a good example, but the problem that we can see here is compliance, how to track compliance, as there is a lack of people available to do this track. The protection of animals at the time of killing, what I'd like to highlight from this one is that the ratio legis in this one, or the reason behind the law, is indeed protecting the welfare or the human killing of the animal, but it also balances other interests like economic and religious interest. And the one on animals used for scientific purposes, what I brought here is that the preamble, it's said in the reasoning, and what it says, or what it covers is ethical concerns, and that animals are sentient creatures, and they even mention concrete species, primates. While animals face significant legal gaps, and as previously mentioned, while conservation laws protect species, individual animal welfare is often overlooked. Trade regulations rarely address their well-being and animals as individuals, and it is often fragmented. Trade regulations like CITES focus on controlling trade, but not the welfare, and other measures like phytosanitary rules, they focus on health risk, but not on welfare and the health of the animal per se. So just brought here on survey result on how it's perceived, how it is seen at European level, what are the reasons why there is lack of compliance, and also how certain measures are understood as effective or somewhat effective. Animal welfare laws in Europe are often considered relatively strong compared with other regions. And we've seen several laws now on certain farming practices that are banned, or even the transportation rules that are aimed to improve welfare. However, these laws still need to, they are imperfect, and they often reflect society current attitudes towards animals, but fall short in areas like enforcement, species-specific needs, even recognizing animals' dignity. So what are those challenges, and what do we need to do to improve? Effective enforcement of animal welfare laws is essential for translating first scientific principles into legal principles, and then into tangible outcomes. And I included here some of the challenges and some numbers. Is one of the ones that were more highlighted is the lack of inspections, and again, seeing Europe as one of very good example of welfare standards. And we have here some numbers of the inspections done per year. Terms like unnecessary suffering, if they are not concrete, they are too open. And also to mention the dual status of animals as objects and sentient beings, and trade goods. And I'd like to put here an example. It's a famous case, maybe you've already heard about it. It's the Jeep the Chicken case in the Netherlands, where a person was helping a chicken in an emergency. And in the end, it led to charges of theft due of the property status of the chicken. So how do animals ensure that these laws are followed? They can't. Animals don't have legal standing, and they lack the right to come to court to participate in legal proceedings. Legal standing requires direct and tangible interest in the case outcome. And I just brought this case because the case of Hiesel, which is a chimpanzee from Austria, where lawyers really tried to gain legal guardianship for Hiesel, but the court denied it, stating that he wasn't a legal person. And I'm bringing this case, first because I'm an attorney and I tend to go to court for that reason, but also because in this case the main topic, it wasn't that much about justice or legal standing. It was more about covering Hiesel welfare. So we can see how are other ways or what is needed to cover individuals' welfare. This could, so if we continue over here, this could lead to some new welfareism and some other debates that we will need at least a pair of classes for that. And it's not the case, but just wanted to put you or show you some examples on how law can help and what other mechanisms in law are needed. And again, animals cannot stand in court. Even if I put here the image of the donkey at court, but we have systems in place to act and ask for to ensure the compliance of or the enforcement of the welfare laws. And just a pair of examples, the tail docking case of pigs, the European Court of Justice ruled that Germany was failing in complying with the European law, not enforcing properly the law. And this case set a precedent and emphasized the obligation of member states to implement and enforce welfare standards. And similar way was the UK's live animal export case. The ruling highlighted the tension between trade regulations and animal welfare, showing the limits that the authority powers have to enforce stricter welfare laws. Okay, so quite ambitious here, trying to say where are we going, or maybe where should we go, or how do we design welfare protection laws? Chose 6 to 7 points, and I said that laws need to really be adapted to the animals. The design of these laws need to be adapted to their specific rationale, and same way that humans usually tend to interpret animals' needs, thinking on how we will feel. It happens also in law. We tend to think that when we are adapting legal mechanisms or writing a law that protects welfare, we need to do something similar that what we'll do to protect a human. But it's not the case, and that leads mostly to a problem. Animal protection laws must be tailored on taking into account the specific needs of different species, considering their behavioral and physical characteristics, but also how we protect animals through law. Yes, mostly these 2 points. So we've seen some examples, and there are some principles that we need to, or we can and should retain, but there are some others that we should improve. We should keep promoting quality of life, protecting physical and emotional health, but probably also recognizing the dignity of animals. I'd say, and I'm referring to one of the first slides, that this will be more or less the point of where we are now, this at European level. Compliance and enforcement and strengthening, and I think that I've repeated that a lot through the presentation, but some laws and principles, they look beautiful on paper, they are beautiful to read, but they really lack practical enforcement. Laws really must go beyond ethical standards, and they really need to include positive obligations, compliance mechanisms, robust monitoring, and meaningful penalties for violation. Yes, I know that I forgot, I'm putting just some examples here, but I also have a syllabus with some other examples and some other national laws, so I'll be happy to share it later. Balancing interests. So we've seen many examples, or some examples, where animal protection and welfare is limited by other interests. And just to put it simple, or to try to reflect it into human rights, we can move freely, but we cannot access another person's property. So there is always a balance between the protection. And animal protection laws need to balance societal, economical, personal interests within the protection of the animals themselves. Robust welfare assessment, moving beyond vague concepts like unnecessary pain. We need the scientific welfare assessment that evaluate the impact of practices on animals. Global approach, and I'm putting here a question mark. Is that the best way? At least some points. I could add here, it is necessary constitutional protection. Probably not for the welfare itself or for the compliance with the laws, but both global approach and constitutional protection are ways to get to a point. Probably some recognition, but again, it's not about beautiful poetic legislation. It's about actionable, clear precepts. And finally, and maybe this probably link with this global approach, One Welfare, there are some people supporting a more integrated approach that combines ecological, economic, and welfare interests linked to human and environment protection. And yes, but it also different parts of protection. Protection can be part of the environment, but also as individuals. Mostly, or in summary, I'd like to say that it is said a lot that law reflects the changes in society. That laws go behind the changes and the societal needs. But I would say that law is also a tool to promote those changes. So with that, I just want to thank you very much. I'm happy to respond to any questions. Hope that I didn't get many English mistakes. And just leaving you with Frida.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. That was great. And so, Frida, over to you for a dive into what's happening in Sweden.
Yes. Can you see my presentation?
Yep, beautifully.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. So, greetings from Sweden. And thank you for the nice introduction of me and for the invitation to this seminar. So, as Georgia said, I will tell you a little bit about the Swedish Animal Welfare Legislation, about the purpose, enforcement, some about the development, but also some challenges, because no one is actually perfect. And I also have, let me see, an alternative title, that is, what has Pippi Longstocking to do with the development of the Swedish Animal Welfare Legislation? So as Yvonne already mentioned, and most of you know, there was a public debate in Europe after World War II. And in 1964, Ruth Harrison, she wrote the book Animal Machines, where she described the negative aspects of intensive animal husbandry. And due to this, the British Parliament instructed the Bramble Committee to investigate the situation and propose measures. And the committee's work resulted in the Bramble Report, where the 5 freedoms were presented the first time. But in that time in Sweden, we had an Animal Welfare Act from 1944 with an aim to protect animals from suffering if possible. However, we also had 3 roots, like women, in Sweden that stood up for animal welfare and created a public debate. So in 1971, the journalist Barbro Soller wrote the book Animal Factory. And she showed similar conditions in Sweden as Ruth had done in the UK. And then in 1985, the children's book author Astrid Lindgren, together with the veterinarian Kristina Forslund, wrote a series of debate articles in the Swedish newspaper Expressen about the poor welfare of farm animals. And these articles were then published in book form, and the book's name is My Cow Wants to Have Fun. And for those who doesn't know who this Astrid Lindgren is, she is quite famous in many countries, and she is really famous and beloved in Sweden. Unfortunately, she is not with us anymore, but she's like the mother of Pippi Longstocking, Emil in Lönneberga, and Ronja the Robber's Daughter, and so on. So in 1988, due to this public debate, Sweden got a new Animal Welfare Act, which in addition to protect animals against unnecessary suffering, now also required that animals must be able to behave naturally. So it was now, for example, when we first have this requirement for summer pasture for cows. And this act is also sometimes called Lex Lindgren in honor of Astrid Lindgren's fight for the animals. So the act from 1988 focused mainly on the absence of unnecessary suffering and a little on natural behaviors. And this approach mirrors quite well the 5 freedoms, where the focus actually is on what we sometimes call negative welfare, meaning that the animals shall at least not have a poor welfare. So if we have this scale from poor welfare to good welfare, the aim of this legislation can be placed somewhere around here. So, however, in 2019, a new Animal Welfare Act entered into force in Sweden, and that's the present one, because the government, they had seen a need for updating and improving the act. And the purpose of our new act is to ensure good animal welfare and promote good animal well-being and respect for animals. And you can say that the new Animal Welfare Act has more focus on natural behaviors and the prevention of stereotypic and unnatural behaviors, and it put more emphasis on the importance that animal owners must be sufficiently competent. So the new act focuses more on achieving a good animal welfare. So the animals should not just not suffer, but instead also experience positive welfare like joy and well-being. So you can say that we are moving beyond the 5 freedoms and more towards the 5 domains, where animals should be provided with good nutrition, good environment, good health, and be able to have appropriate behavior and also positive mental experiences. So if we again look at this scale, the new aim of this, or the new act's aim, will be placed more to the right this time. And in the bill to the new act, the government has stated that animals have an intrinsic value regardless of the benefit they have for humans. And also that research aims to develop positive welfare indicators. It may therefore be possible in the future to design new regulations in legislation that can address additional aspects of animal welfare. And Sweden has also been recognized for having a quite strong legislation by others, for example, by the World Animal Protection, who are responsible for the Animal Protection Index, where on the basis of 4 goals and 10 indicators, countries are scored from A to G, where A has the best animal protection. But as you can see, there are actually no A country. But Sweden, together with the UK, Denmark, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, we are in category B. So then you might wonder, okay, but why is Sweden not then an A country? Well, it's among other things because we have a quite weak protection for animals used for recreation and also for wild animals. And fur farming is still allowed in Sweden. But if you look at the development of the legislation, the level of animal welfare in the Swedish legislation has in general been improved during the last decades. So, for example, cows must be on summer pasture. All pigs in Sweden must have access to straw. Sows must be able to nest build before farrowing, and they must be loose-housed, so crated sows are forbidden. Horses, they must have daily access to outdoor paddocks, and they must have social contact with other horses. Tail docking is forbidden of all animals, for example, pigs and dogs. Beak trimming of poultry is forbidden. Slaughter without stunning is forbidden. And the focus on good housing and management in the Swedish legislation has led to a very low use of antibiotics because healthy animals does not need medication or treatment. It has also been forbidden for a long time in Sweden to give antibiotics for preventive purposes or to increase animal growth. In Sweden, we have a history of having a quite high trust in the government and the legislation. So our strategy to improve animal welfare within our country have been and still is to improve the governmental legislation and not leave animal welfare in the hands of private actors. And as you can see in this flag diagram, Sweden is up to the left, having a high perception of animal welfare by the stakeholders and the society, and aims to improve animal welfare mainly through legislation. On the other side, you can see the UK and also the Netherlands, for example, having a higher trust in the private sector when improving animal welfare through different kind of private standards. So there are different traditions, and it might be so that one strategy does not fit all. But however, this is probably one of the reasons why we have a very comprehensive animal welfare legislation. Our legislation covers all animals kept by humans, and there are detailed species-specific regulations for most of them. So we have legislation for pet animals and farm animals and zoo animals and sport animals and lab animals and so on. And our legislation is structured in 3 steps. We have the Animal Welfare Act, decided by the Parliament, the Animal Welfare Ordinance, decided by the government, and then we have animal welfare regulations that are decided by the Swedish Board of Agriculture, SBA. And it's the regulations that are quite detailed and species specific. However, as in many other countries, there could be a perceived, and sometimes there is a gap between the more general act and the more detailed regulations. And I would say especially now when we have a new Animal Welfare Act with higher animal welfare standards, but the regulations has not changed since before that. And it's the SBA's task to close or at least minimize this gap through their regulations. And for the moment, we are waiting for a new regulation for exotic pet animals like rabbits and rodents and reptiles and fish and birds and so on. And according to the SPA, it will have more focus on the animal's natural behaviors and be more in line with the new Animal Welfare Act. So we are waiting with excitement what the suggestion will look like. Would it still, for example, be possible to keep these large parrots and rabbits in cages, or will we end the cage age also for some of these animals? But as many of you are aware of, when the species-specific requirements are set, it is not only the welfare of the animals that is important, but the SPA, they also consider other aspects like traditions and values in society and economy, because the society, they kind of demand that it's possible to keep farm animals and make a living from them. So even if the Swedish Animal Welfare Act requires a good animal welfare and natural behavior, it is still possible to, for example, keep dairy cows in tie stalls for 8 to 10 months per year, depending on where in Sweden you live, north or south. It is also allowed to keep bulls indoor in pens with fully slatted floor all year round, because there are no demand for bulls to graze during summer. And it's allowed to keep minks in small cages for fur farming. And I would say that the drive for Swedish farmers to be competitive on the EU market is perhaps the greatest challenge right now for farm animal welfare in Sweden. And animal welfare is often blamed when it is more expensive to produce food in Sweden compared with other EU countries, even if that's not always the truth, actually. So unfortunately, we have had a couple of setbacks during recent years due to this competition. And for example, the lowest allowed weaning age for piglets has decreased from 28 to 21 days of age. And an investigation commissioned by the government now suggests that the grazing requirement for loose-housed dairy cows should be removed. And we do not know yet if this will happen. However, I would say that the risk has never been so high as it is now. And it would be really sad for the welfare of dairy cows in Sweden if this requirement is removed. And even if we have a new act that goes further than the one before, we can also see that the political will have changed during the last decades. And I would say that the ambition level has decreased for farm animal welfare. And behind this change is a quite strong farming industry that's working hard to influence the politicians. And about 20 years back, the government, they wanted to improve the animal welfare level. They wanted to make stricter animal welfare requirements and said that Sweden should really be at the forefront. Nowadays, it's mostly about maintaining the animal welfare level and make cost-effective regulations that are simplified and more flexible. And the government also often state that other countries, including EU, need to improve their animal welfare legislation to reach up to Sweden's level, and also that the EU legislation must be better enforced. Because from a Swedish perspective, one reason for improving the enforcement of the EU legislation is to make the competition for farmers more fair, because it's quite unfair when it's okay for some to violate the legislation without any consequences. So for example, it is actually forbidden in EU in all EU countries to tail dock pigs on a regular basis. However, most EU countries violate this requirement. So why isn't that enforced? We are few countries that do comply, for example, Sweden and Finland, which actually then proves that it is not impossible to comply, but it requires good housing and management. So for a legislation to be strong, it has to be enforced and complied with. So how about the enforcement and compliance of the Swedish animal welfare legislation? Well, we have the official animal welfare inspections that are carried out by the county administrative boards. Sweden is divided in 21 counties, like regions. At slaughterhouses, animal welfare inspections are also made by official veterinarians employed by the National Food Agency. And the police authority are also sometimes involved, as they can assist the cab inspector if needed. They can seizure animals if the cab are not available, and they will investigate crimes against animals. And there are different reasons behind why an inspection is made. So first of all, we have the planned risk-based routine inspections, which are carried out on premises that the cab is aware of. So it's, for example, farms, slaughterhouses, riding schools, dog kennels, cat shelters, and research facilities. And then we have inspections after complaints for the public or from a veterinarian working at a vet clinic or so on. And we have these extra inspections due to previously non-compliances. So it's like a follow-up inspection. And what decisions can CAB make if non-compliances are discovered? So after an inspection, they always write an inspection report. And there, in that they describes the inspection, and it also contains information on what the animal keeper have agreed to correct, if any. But if the situation is more severe, they can make decisions about injunctions, and they can be linked to a conditional fine. And the county administrative board can also seizure animals and decide on animal bans. And the CAB, they can also make notifications to a police or prosecutor who will investigate if a crime have been committed. And if that's the case, the punishment is either a fine or imprisonment. And for violation of the animal welfare legislation, there is a maximum of 2 years in prison. And for animal cruelty, there is a maximum of 4 years in prison. So how often are animal welfare inspections carried out in Sweden? Well, we have a national goal that at least 10% of the farms with food-producing animals must be inspected each year. And then we have an EU demand that 1/3 of the premises with permission to use research animals must be inspected each year. So do we achieve these goals? Well, in 2023, 6.3% of the farms were inspected, and actually less than 10% of the research facilities. And for other type of animals, there are no such goals. And today a lot of, the pet and horse owners, they are mainly inspected after complaints. So I would say that our number one challenge when it comes to the enforcement is actually the lack of resources put on the animal welfare control. And it's the government that controls the finances to the county administrative boards. So, to conclude, Sweden has a quite strong animal welfare legislation and a well-organized inspection system. But due to the current political level of ambition and lack of resources, there are some challenges, and we may soon need a new Astrid Lindgren. So, thanks for listening.